viewers, and welcome back to Media Scan, your weekend dose of headlines, controversies and perspectives. What a week this has been. The pride and glory of seeing our Olympians return from Tokyo turned into shame on witnessing the scenes in Parliament. We will discuss the media's coverage of the whole subject. But first, what made news? That the monsoon session of Parliament was heading for near washout had become clear much earlier. But even the worst cynics could not have visualized the scenes of members dancing on the table, Parliament functionaries being pushed and banged, and the chairman of the upper house driven to tears. This session will go down in the records not just as one of the least productive, but also as one which shocked the entire nation. More on that in just a few moments. Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, the celebration of 75 years of India's independence, has taken off in full swing with inspiring events all over the country. Young and old have been sending their videos singing the national anthem, while citizens came out enthusiastically for the Fit India Freedom Run organized on Friday. We urge you to join wholeheartedly in the year-long celebrations too. Despite the near washout, both houses of Parliament passed the Constitution 127th Amendment Bill 2021 earlier this week. The bill seeks to restore the rights of states to identify other backward castes in their respective states. This practice had been discontinued by a Supreme Court order. The Taliban's capture of almost half of the Afghan provinces and its advance to the outskirts of Kabul has raised concerns worldwide, including in New Delhi. All through the week, geopolitical experts tried to analyze the repercussions of the move. Most commentators agreed that the Afghan forces had almost given up the fight against the Taliban. They were welcomed with open arms, wide smiles and much singing and dancing when the Olympians touched back on the Indian soil. Neeraj Chopra, the first Indian gold medalist in athletics, and all other medal winners were felicitated the same evening. India's haul of 7 medals is the best so far in the Olympics. So those were the headlines throughout the week which we all saw in the media space this time. Viewers, the week started with much pride and glory as our winning Olympians returned from Tokyo, bringing cheer and happiness to the whole country. This was also the week that the 75 years of independence celebrations have kicked off, bringing pride and glory to all of us. However, the week that should have been noted for its pride and glory and jubilation was marred by the happenings in the Parliament of India. What started with snatching and tearing of papers, a lot of heckling and shouting, finally descended to the level of senior members climbing atop tables in the upper house, making noise inside the house, leading to hurt and intimidation of parliamentary staff, and finally things reducing to the level that the chairman of Rajya Sabha was pushed to tears. In a way, the choked voice of Chairman Venkaiah Naidu reflected the sentiments of the whole nation. The pain and anguish was reflected by all of us. Why did things come to such a pass? What does it mean for the independence, the democracy, and the identity of a nation which is at the cusp of 75 years of independence? I have here with me Mr. Chakshu Roy, the head of the Legislative and Research Wing of the PRS Legislative, perhaps the only organization in the country which tries to make legislative issues easier and better, not only for us, but even for the parliamentarians. Welcome, Mr. Roy.
Thank you for having me on your show.
I also have here with me Mr. Sanjay Singh, senior political journalist, commentator. You have been reading him and hearing him on Doordarshan quite often. Welcome, Mr. Sanjay Singh. And I hope with you and Mr. Roy here, we are going to have a proper, well-rounded discussion on this very sensitive subject. Mr. Roy, let me come to you first, sir. We have been reading a lot. In fact, I read your analysis as well, which was one of the best that has appeared on the subject. And we have also been listening to a lot of heated debate in the television screens, on the digital media. But to put it in a nutshell, sir, what, according to you, is the substantive loss that the country, the electorate and the exchequer has suffered because of this near washout of the monsoon session of Parliament? Mr. Roy.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, one, I would characterize the washout as not only as near but complete, because the only piece of legislation that actually got discussed on the floor of the House was the Constitutional Amendment Bill, on which there was some kind of a consensus that was built between the ruling party and the opposition, and it could be debated extensively in both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Coming to the question of loss, the entire 17 days that the session functioned, barely any work could take place. Bills were passed in a din. Ministers could not be questioned during question hour. So when you ask me as to what is the loss to the nation to the nation is the opportunity lost that Parliament had for telling the nation as to what is happening in the COVID situation, what is happening in the economy, hearing the government's viewpoints on a range of subjects. Apart from that, when legislation gets passed in a hurry, what happens is that there could be a possibility that the legislation that comes out of Parliament is not perfect. If there was debate on those legislations, the ruling party could have said things about why the legislation is being brought about and the justification for it. The opposition would have had the opportunity to point out if there were things that need to be rectified or things to be made to strengthen the law on the ground. When these things don't happen, laws that are made for the entire country suffer. So to me, the loss that has happened in this parliamentary session is not even quantifiable. We didn't have a winter session of Parliament because of the pandemic. The budget session was cut short this year. The budget session was cut short last year. In this kind of a backdrop, where the time of Parliament should have been sacrosanct and every minute should have mattered, the entire session was squandered away.
So, Mr. Roy, I'll just put a very brief interjection here before I bring in Mr. Sanjay Singh into our discussion. And as you have rightly pointed out, this is such a huge opportunity lost for the country, particularly because in 2 years, this was perhaps the first full-fledged proper regular session that we were having. So, we should have made the most of it. But unfortunately, things went completely contrary to what should have happened. So, what you are trying to stress here is, as the media is usually want to do, we try to calculate the loss to the exchequer, the monetary setback that we suffer if the Parliament does not function smoothly. But in fact, it's the loss to democracy, the loss of discussion, which is even more important. Isn't that what you are saying, Mr. Roy?
Monetary loss is something that you can make up. You can recoup that loss. But how do you recoup the opportunity for an entire nation? If the Parliament did not work for 2 more days, the session was supposed to be 19 days, it only worked for 17 days.
Yes.
What happens to the opportunity in those 2 days that was existing? Members of Parliament across the aisle put in so many questions. Everybody came to Delhi to discuss and to debate. None of that could take place. So, putting a money cost, I think, would be a very narrow viewpoint. The cost is to the entire country.
Let me bring in Sanjay Singh here on that interesting point where you have just left the discussion. Mr. Sanjay Singh, you just heard Chakshu Roy tell us that monetary loss can still be made up at some point of time. But it is the setback to democracy, the hurt and the setback that people suffer in terms of, strengthening the democratic pillars of the country, which should worry us. On that point, I'd like to take some of the media's treatment of the subject in this whole week and perhaps even before this week. There were 2 very distinct viewpoints that I could gather by listening to the television debates, the digital debates, and of course, writings in newspapers. There were certain national dailies who completely put the onus of the loss of the session on the government, saying it is for the government to create an atmosphere whereby the session can work smoothly. Whereas there were certain other experts and op-ed writers who felt that the opposition has been too belligerent, and in fact, when a session does not function properly, there is no debate, the loss is more to the opposition than the government, because the government still managed to get its legislation passed with or without debate. We also saw the television showing clippings of a woman marshal, a male marshal getting badly banged and hurt in the whole process while they were just trying to do their duty assigned to them. Putting all this together, Mr. Singh, how do you look at the media's treatment of the subject? Have we been fair to the parliamentarians, to the subject at hand? And did the media manage to take all aspects while debating the issue? Mr. Singh.
Smita, you have raised a very vital question as to how media reacted. I was surprised. For first 2-3 days, first day when it happened 3 days in a row. When disturbances, unfortunately, we are taking that as for granted. This is something which has become normal. When on day one, the certain members entered and there was kind of a ruckus, hooliganism, I would say, street side hooliganism. I'm not sure whether this comes under privilege, but even if it does, people actually feel that there was kind of street side hooliganism inside the parliament. When on day one it occurred, it found a small news item inside on two double column news, and there also it was a straight reportage. In fact, one leading newspaper, in fact the newspaper which claims to be biggest newspaper, did not even reflect a line as to what kind of ruckus opposition members created in the house.
Allow me to interrupt you here, Mr. Sanjay Singh. Mr. Singh, if I may interrupt, you are saying that had the kind of ruckus that was being created in the two houses, had that been highlighted properly by the media, perhaps it might not have happened. Is that what you are saying? Because the opposition members started feeling that they had to do something bigger to get the attention. Is that your argument?
No, my argument is slightly different. See, they create disturbances with a misplaced opinion that if they create disturbances, shout slogans, wave placards, and force adjournments in the house, they'll find some space in the media. Unfortunately, over a period in time, this has become a kind of a normal practice by the opposition, and therefore this is nothing more than a ticker or a small news capsule or something in the media. But still, they try and do that. This time around, this passed that thin line between disturbance and between hooliganism. This was something else. This was plain rowdyism inside the precincts of parliament, which is temple of democracy. And in there, again, I would go much deeper or slightly more than what has happened. Why it happened? In fact, if you look at it...
Okay, Mr. Singh, I'll come back to that aspect of why it happened. But just before that, I want to bring in Chakshu Roy on one particular point here. Mr. Roy, Mr. Sanjay Singh is trying to say that, protests and ruckus in the house is nothing new for us. We have all been witness to it, both of you more than me perhaps. But this time round, things went to a completely different level. I mean, would you agree? There is a limit to protest also, isn't it?
I think, I would really like to hear what Sanjay sir, the point that Sanjay was trying to make, because then, it will allow me to, comment and reflect on, because he's observed media for a very long time. So if we hear his point, it would allow me to reflect on what he said a little better.
Right. So, Sanjay Singh, please carry on. You were saying, why do you think things reached such a situation, such a shameful state of things? Please carry on.
To the question that you're asking, in fact, there is a misplaced opinion that if you create ruckus, if you create disturbances and you shout slogans, placards, force adjournments in the house, then you'll find some space in the media. Unfortunately, that has not been happening, and therefore, this time around, you see there was a demand from the opposition that Rajya Sabha TV and Lok Sabha TV is not showing what they were actually doing. In fact, they should have been ashamed of what sections of opposition leaders were doing inside the house, but yet they want to convey whatever message they want to convey. The mainstream media, in fact, the television news channels had their reporters talked a bit about that. But unfortunately, the kind of ruckus, the kind of hooliganism and that kind of thin line that was crossed inside the upper house, that is Rajya Sabha, Council of States, which is in popular perception, people are more sober there, people are more educated there, and people who are nominated to represent that particular party in Rajya Sabha on behalf of particular state, they are more learned, and therefore the quality of debate in Rajya Sabha is much higher. Unfortunately, for last some time, we are witnessing a very sorry state of affairs in Rajya Sabha. So this time around, the media generally, for first 2-3 days, I was very surprised to find that some mainstream newspapers in particular, the biggest newspaper in particular, did not report that some members in the House climbed atop reporters' desk. Reporters' desk, for benefit of viewers, is the place where parliament staffers who actually note down proceedings of parliament sit right in front of Secretary General of Rajya Sabha or Lok Sabha. They climbed atop table of Secretary General and did whatever ruckus they wanted to create. And that was completely unacceptable.
And then a glass pane was broken, hurting one of the parliament functionaries in that whole melee.
Yeah, precisely. You said it right. Unfortunately, media, in fact, woke from, or the media was completely stirred when that news capsule, when that Rajya Sabha capsule came out in public. Video footage whereby a woman marshal was seen to be pushed, pulled, and completely manhandled by some women MPs. And there was, the behavior was for everyone in the country to see that was completely unpardonable, shameful, condemnable behavior that our parliamentarian were
Okay, I'll come back to you, Sanjay Singh. Let me bring Chakshu Roy again here for the next, the next aspect of the whole debate. Chakshu Roy, one thing from that I gather from Mr. Sanjay Singh's argument is that, when the opposition thinks it can create ruckus because it gives them attention of the country, that also is a case of diminishing returns, because there is only so much of ruckus that we can take. However, since Sanjay Singh mentioned the plight of the woman marshal, and there were other people in my information among the parliament staff and functionaries who had to bear the brunt of the violence. Mr. Chakshu Roy, we saw and we have read news reports and the chairman himself hinting, even the Lok Sabha speaker saying that perhaps the existing rule books are not enough for the kind of the ruckus, even violence that we are witnessing in the House. And so they are mulling about what kind of action can be initiated in order to make the House come back to order. And action can even be given out if the members, perhaps even when the session is not there, because the members continue to be parliamentarians and members of the House. Seeing the emotional state of the chairman of Rajya Sabha, the concern showed by Lok Sabha Speaker, do you think that the existing committees, the existing rule books have enough provisions in order to control situations like this? Or perhaps, as we saw once during the UPA rule, a separate committee will have to be constituted to go into the kind of things that we saw this time, including the hurt and humiliation of the parliamentary staff. Mr. Roy.
So, Smitaji, Mr. Singh made a very interesting observation, which was the normalization of disruptions. And when disruptions get normalized, now this is not the first time that disruptions are happening in our legislature. They have happened in the past. In fact, in 2001, speakers on precisely the subject. And in that conference, one of the things that came out was that the Lok Sabha rules were changed, and the Lok Sabha rules provided for an automatic suspension of MPs if they disturbed the House or if they disrupted the House. Now, there is another element. A couple of days ago, the Supreme Court came out with a judgment. It was in regard to some disruptions that had happened in the Kerala Legislative Assembly. And the Supreme Court ruled that some of the disruptive actions there do not come within the protection of parliamentary or legislative privilege. Now, for me, it is worrying from two angles. One, as to when one member of parliament impedes upon the right to speaking of another member of parliament, or when the entire house gets disturbed, what is the mechanism that parliament should take? Should it, formulate its own committee? I was reading parliamentary debates when President Radhakrishnan, for the first time, had come to Parliament to give his President's speech. His speech, which is one of the most sacrosanct occasions in Parliament, was disturbed. The Lok Sabha then formed a committee to inquire into the subject and recommend punishments. And the punishment that the Lok Sabha committee recommended was that the speaker from the chair of the house issued a reprimand to the concerned MPs. Now, clearly, one of the things that we have to do is, our parliament needs to consider as to what is the treatment that it, takes out to its members and also to political parties, because it's not an issue that is just limited to the members. Members represent political parties. So how should this matter entirely be treated is something that needs urgent attention.
Okay, Mr. Roy, you've left it at a very interesting point, and I'll just bring in Sanjay Singh here very briefly because I have hardly a minute left with me to carry on from where you left the discussion. Sanjay Singh, we have been reading and people have been commenting often that what plays out in the two houses of parliament is actually a reflection of what is going to happen in the respective states, particularly when some states have an important election coming up. Perhaps we saw the aftermath of the West Bengal elections playing out in the two houses of parliament. Perhaps the upcoming Punjab elections was a factor, maybe Uttar Pradesh, and we have seen that in the past as well. But my very simple and direct question to you, sir, and please if you may tell me briefly, is it anybody's case that the state's elections or the state politics gets reflected on the floor of parliament to an extent that the job of legislation is completely scuttled and members do not even get the chance to raise issues of their areas? Is that any politics, even if we look at it from the view of a state party or a regional party in the country?
Smita, this time around we see a different situation. What you were saying, we saw that in the past. This time situation is slightly different. The TMC is very booed after winning West Bengal elections. BJP did well in West Bengal elections as well, from 2-3 to 75-78, and TMC winning hands down. The problem here is that it's not about UP elections. We thought that this was going to be centered and focused with an eye on UP election, but this is unfortunately not. The problem is they are thinking in terms of 2024 elections, the opposition, and who is going to take a pole position, whether Congress is going to take a pole position as that was case in the past, or TMC is going to take a pole position, or Sharad Pawar is going to take a pole position vis-a-vis Narendra Modi government. The problem lay that Modi, they thought was there was slide in his popularity rating during second wave of pandemic because of the spread of the disease, but after that the government, Modi government, contained it, and Prime Minister was seen to be very active. And subsequently, he announced a series of welfare measures as well as measures to contain the disease and to prepare country for a possible third wave. So his popularity graph was back where it was, or perhaps even rising.
So you are saying that since things did not go the way the opposition had anticipated, particularly post West Bengal elections, so that is what is getting reflected or got reflected during the entire monsoon session, unfortunately. On that note, Sanjay Singh, I am afraid I have to cut short your argument here, but perhaps we will soon catch up one of these weekends for a more in-depth discussion on the same subject. So let me thank Sanjay Singh here. Thank you very much for explaining it so well to us. Mr. Chakshu Roy, thank you also very much for joining Media Scan for the first time, and I hope it will not be the last time. And viewers, as both our guests pointed out very clearly, there are any number of political considerations which get reflected and get played out on the floors of Parliament when political parties are hell-bent on making a certain political point. The only question here is any political consideration or political point so important that the entire business of legislation and debate gets completely scuttled and pushed out of track? Think about that, viewers, and continue to watch DD India. as we continue to scan the media for you. Good night.